In ancient Egypt, the desire for immortality was not just a wish but an unshakable conviction that death was not the end. The afterlife was seen as the ultimate goal, the final destination for those worthy of eternal life. Yet, the path to achieving this immortality was far from serene. To the ancient Egyptians, immortality was not a gift freely given, but something that had to be earned through suffering and sacrifice. The notion that one could transcend the mortal realm and join the gods in an eternal afterlife was woven deeply into the fabric of their culture, religion, and rituals. However, what made this belief truly horrifying was the sheer scale of the suffering that individuals had to endure to achieve such a lofty goal. To the Egyptians, suffering was not seen as a negative force to be avoided. Instead, it was a transformative process, an ordeal that purified the soul and prepared the body for its eternal journey. It was through this pain that a person's essence could be made worthy of life beyond the grave. This was not mere punishment. This was sacred, spiritual cleansing. They believed that only by enduring immense physical pain and even death could one become truly eternal. This disturbing connection between agony and the divine reflects an ancient psychological belief that the greatest of rewards could only be obtained through the greatest of sacrifices. At the heart of this belief was a central paradox. Immortality was promised to those who suffered the most, yet the suffering itself was an inevitable consequence of a sacred, divine law. In this world, suffering was not just inevitable, it was necessary, a divine test of faith and endurance. For the Egyptians, immortality was something earned through ritual, an endurance of pain and transformation that was not just physical but deeply spiritual. The more a person was willing to endure, the greater their chances of being granted eternal life. As we peel back the layers of this ancient belief, we are confronted with the chilling reality that immortality was not a reward for living a good life or for making a peaceful transition to the afterlife. Instead, it was for those who could withstand extreme agony, suffering that twisted the boundaries of human endurance. Those who sought immortality did not simply pass from this world to the next. They were forced to go through an excruciating process of transformation, one that tested every facet of their being. The notion of pain and suffering as an essential step toward immortality reveals a deeper, darker truth about the human psyche. In the pursuit of eternal life, individuals were pushed to the limits of what it means to be human. The sacrifice of the body and soul to the gods was not an easy act of devotion. It was an ordeal that demanded the breaking and remaking of the self. This was the ultimate test of faith, and the prize was nothing short of eternal existence among the gods. In this introduction, we set the stage for a deeper exploration of these rituals, where we will uncover the painful truths about the lengths ancient Egyptians went to in their pursuit of immortality. The cost of this divine favor was staggering, and we will soon learn that the path to eternal life was paved not with reverence and respect for life, but with unimaginable suffering. This journey into the ancient Egyptian obsession with immortality is one that will reveal the true price of an eternity beyond death, suffering that would haunt the souls of those who dared to seek it. The ancient Egyptians held a worldview that was intricately woven into the fabric of their religious beliefs, their view of the afterlife, and the role of suffering in their quest for immortality. Unlike modern perspectives where life is often seen as something that should be preserved at all costs, the Egyptians viewed death not as an end, but as a transition. The journey into the afterlife was seen as a natural progression, a continuation of the soul's existence beyond the physical body. However, this transition was not without immense spiritual and physical challenges. Death was merely a threshold, and passing through it successfully required more than just the ritualistic preparation of the body. It demanded sacrifice, purification, and above all, suffering. In Egyptian thought, immortality was not a given, nor was it something to be earned through good deeds alone. Immortality was seen as the ultimate reward for those who could transcend the trials of life and death. The Egyptians believed that the soul, or Ka, had to journey through a complex and perilous afterlife, often depicted as a series of trials and tribulations that tested its worthiness to join the gods. The gods themselves were often portrayed as beings who had suffered, and it was through their own pain and suffering that they had earned their divinity. This idea of suffering as a divine trial permeated the Egyptian mindset and was foundational to their beliefs about the afterlife. At the center of Egyptian religious thought was the god Osiris, the god of the afterlife, death, and resurrection. Osiris himself was a god who had been betrayed, killed, and dismembered by his brother Set, only to be resurrected through the magic of his wife, Isis. Osiris' death and rebirth served as a symbol of the cycle of life, death, and resurrection. The Egyptians believed that by undergoing rituals of suffering, they too could emulate Osiris, experiencing a form of death and rebirth that would cleanse their souls and ensure their place in the afterlife. Through these rituals they would not merely avoid the void of non-existence, but instead enter into a state of divine immortality, much like their gods. The belief in a soul's journey through the afterlife led to the practice of mummification, which, although centered on preserving the body for its journey, was also a form of ritualized suffering. The physical body had to be preserved in a certain way to ensure the soul's successful passage into the afterlife, but the process itself was one that involved the painful and meticulous removal of organs, the drying of the body, and the wrapping of the corpse. The Egyptians saw this as a necessary purification, a sacrifice made to ensure the soul's passage into eternity. This process was a profound metaphor for the suffering required to transcend death. The ancient Egyptians' fixation on the afterlife was not simply a way to prolong life. It was their way of ensuring that life had meaning beyond the earthly plane. Immortality was viewed as the ultimate goal, but it was not easily won. It required not just devotion to the gods but a willingness to endure suffering as part of a greater spiritual transformation. The Egyptians understood that only by passing through pain could one come out the other side purified and reborn. This understanding was not limited to the priests and the nobility but was an ideal that reached all corners of Egyptian society, from the pharaohs to the common folk. The gods, too, were central to this process. The Egyptian pantheon was populated by deities who had undergone immense trials and suffering, and these stories served as both cautionary tales and guiding principles for those seeking immortality. The sun god Ra, for example, traveled through the underworld every night, battling the forces of chaos to ensure the sun would rise again. This cosmic struggle was a metaphor for the human soul's own journey through the darkness of death and into the light of eternity. The idea was that if the gods could endure such suffering and emerge victorious, so too could a human soul. This deep connection between suffering, the divine, and immortality is what made the Egyptian worldview so strikingly different from many modern religions, where suffering is often viewed as a punishment. In ancient Egypt, suffering was a sacred and transformative process. It was the necessary step to purification, rebirth, and eternal life. This worldview is what underpinned the rituals of suffering that would unfold later in Egyptian religious practices. Death, in their eyes, was not an end but a beginning, a painful but necessary step on the path to eternal life. In the midst of this belief system, the Egyptians not only had to confront their physical mortality, but also their deepest fears about the void that lay beyond death. The rituals of suffering were not just about preparing for the afterlife, they were about confronting the very essence of existence. The pursuit of immortality was a deeply human desire, born out of the fear of nothingness, and it was through suffering that the Egyptians believed they could transcend this fear. Immortality was not a reward for a peaceful death, it was for those who could endure the worst of human experiences and emerge spiritually purified. As we continue to explore the rituals and beliefs surrounding immortality, it becomes clear that for the ancient Egyptians, suffering was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was an integral part of their religious journey, one that linked them to the divine and the eternal. The gods suffered, the people suffered, and in their suffering they believed they would find the key to immortality. The sacrifice of the body was not an end but a means to an even greater beginning, eternity. This complex, paradoxical worldview set the stage for the horrors and wonders that would unfold in the rites of passage to the afterlife. The act of bodily sacrifice in ancient Egypt was not a mere act of physical endurance. It was the very key to transcending the mortal world and achieving immortality. While the mummification process itself is often romanticized as a sophisticated preservation technique, it was much more than an embalming procedure. For the Egyptians, it was a ritual of transformation, a process that intertwined the body and soul in a symbiotic relationship where pain was seen as the bridge between life and eternity. This gruesome act of bodily sacrifice was steeped in profound religious meaning, revealing the Egyptian belief that the body was not merely a vessel to be discarded but a sacred entity that needed to endure suffering to achieve spiritual purity. The ancient Egyptians believed that for the soul to find peace in the afterlife, the body had to undergo a ritual cleansing. It was not enough to simply prepare the soul for eternity, the body itself had to be purified, tested, and transformed through excruciating rituals. This purification required the complete removal of the internal organs, each step carried out with precision and care by the priests. But the removal of the heart was the most significant act, as it was believed to be the seat of one's identity and soul. The heart had to remain in the body during the mummification process to ensure the soul's return to its physical form. However, for those who underwent the most intense rituals, even the heart was removed as part of the purification process. In these cases, the soul's journey through the afterlife was not guaranteed, creating a horrific tension between preservation and abandonment. This severing of the physical body from its soul was symbolic of the broader Egyptian belief in suffering as a tool for transformation. The painful process of dissection and preservation mirrored the soul's journey through the afterlife, where it would have to face trials, temptations, and judgments to prove its worthiness for immortality. The Egyptians believed that only by passing through these trials, by experiencing the physical, emotional, and spiritual agony of purification, could the soul achieve divine status. In a sense, the body became a vessel of suffering, purging itself of its human weaknesses to become something divine. In this worldview, the body's pain was not tragic or futile. It was necessary for the soul to be reborn in the afterlife. Yet, the physical toll of these rituals went far beyond simple embalming. Priests and attendants would often engage in their own form of bodily sacrifice as they performed these rituals. The pain they felt while preparing the deceased's body was not only a reflection of the individual undergoing the ritual, but also of the priest's personal transformation. The priests themselves, as intermediaries between the living and the gods, had to endure these torturous processes to maintain their spiritual purity. They had to cleanse themselves of their own humanity to ensure that they could properly assist in the purification of others. Their suffering too was considered sacred, reinforcing the idea that only through enduring pain could one achieve spiritual clarity. In addition to the internal organ removals, the physical body had to undergo further treatments that were both painful and invasive. The skin was carefully preserved through a complex method of drying and embalming, a process that could take up to 70 days. During this time, the body would be dehydrated to prevent decay, ensuring that the body would not break down during the soul's journey. This was a painful reminder of the inevitable decay of flesh, but in the context of the Egyptians' religious beliefs, it was part of a necessary purification. Through this grueling process, the body was made ready for its voyage to the afterlife, symbolizing the painful journey of the soul itself. But beyond the rituals of preservation, there were the rites of sacrifice that focused on the living. The Egyptians believed that immortality was not simply granted after death, but was a continuous process that required ongoing acts of devotion. These acts were often brutal and involved the voluntary sacrifice of the living body, symbolizing a willingness to endure physical torment as an offering to the gods. One of the most disturbing aspects of these sacrifices was the practice of self-inflicted mutilation, a demonstration of faith and devotion that went to extreme lengths. Priests and nobles seeking to honor the gods would often participate in these rituals by cutting or marking their own bodies. The act of self-mutilation was seen as a physical offering, a sacrifice made in the hopes of gaining divine favor. These acts of suffering were not seen as futile or tragic, but as necessary for maintaining the balance between life, death, and the divine. The physical pain experienced by those who participated in these rites was viewed as a way of purifying their bodies and their spirits, further reinforcing the connection between pain and rebirth in the Egyptian religious worldview. One of the most chilling examples of this sacrificial pain was the ritual of the opening of the mouth, which was performed on both the living and the dead. This ritual, intended to ensure that the deceased could speak and interact with the gods in the afterlife, required a form of bodily sacrifice where the participant's mouth was marked, often with a sharp object, to signify their spiritual readiness for the afterlife. The pain of this process was believed to awaken the soul, preparing it for its journey beyond the physical world. For the living, it was a deeply personal transformation. For the dead, it was an act of liberation from the confines of mortality. The Egyptians also believed that certain deities were intimately tied to the process of bodily suffering. Hathor, the goddess of love and motherhood, was also associated with rebirth and suffering. Her role in the afterlife was to guide souls through the trials of death, ensuring they experienced a painful but necessary transformation before reaching eternal life. In the eyes of the ancient Egyptians, it was not just the gods who demanded sacrifice. Their followers too had to embody the suffering of the divine. The act of bodily sacrifice was an essential component of Egyptian spirituality, a transformative ordeal that reflected the gods' own sufferings and ensured the soul's passage into eternity. The physicality of these rituals was not just a reflection of the Egyptians' belief in the sanctity of pain, it was an intrinsic part of their worldview, where the act of suffering became intertwined with their understanding of immortality. The sacrifices, whether they were made by priests or the dead, were seen as tests of endurance and faith, as the body underwent excruciating pain in order to prepare for the spiritual transformation that would guarantee eternal life. The body, in its most tortured state, became a vehicle for the soul's rebirth. It was through this agonizing process that the soul could break free from the constraints of the mortal world and ascend to join the gods. Ultimately, the Egyptians' sacrificial rituals surrounding the body were more than just physical acts. They were deeply psychological. They reflected a worldview in which suffering was not just something to be endured, it was something to be embraced, purified, and transcended. The body, marked and scarred by ritual suffering, became a sacred vessel in the quest for eternal life, demonstrating the extreme lengths the ancient Egyptians were willing to go to in order to secure their place in the afterlife. The mummification process is one of the most iconic and recognizable aspects of ancient Egyptian culture, symbolizing their obsession with death, preservation, and the afterlife. While it is often celebrated for its artistry and precision, beneath the layers of linen and gold, mummification was deeply connected to the Egyptian worldview of suffering, sacrifice, and spiritual transformation. This ritual, which preserved the body for eternity, was not only an act of physical preparation, it was a profound spiritual journey that required the living to confront death, decay, and the very essence of human mortality. Mummification was an elaborate, multi-stage process that could take weeks to complete, requiring immense labor and dedication from the priests who performed it. Every step of the process was laden with symbolic meaning, and the pain involved in the procedure mirrored the pain that would be endured in the afterlife. The mummification process was a reflection of the Egyptian belief that death was not the end but a transformation, an initiation into a new life, which came at a great cost. Only by enduring this transformation, both in life and in death, could one achieve the immortality that was promised by the gods. The process began with the washing and purification of the body, an essential first step to cleanse the deceased of their earthly sins and prepare them for the trials that awaited them in the afterlife. The body was anointed with oils, herbs, and resins, which not only served to preserve it but were believed to possess divine properties that would protect the soul. The Egyptians believed that the body was not simply a physical vessel, it was a sacred container for the soul, and every part of it needed to be carefully preserved to ensure the soul's journey to eternity would be smooth. The next stage in the mummification process was the removal of the internal organs, which had to be carefully extracted, embalmed, and stored in canopic jars. Each organ represented a different aspect of the human soul, and their removal symbolized the severing of the body's earthly ties. The intestines, lungs, stomach, and liver were removed, cleaned, and preserved separately to protect the body from decay and to ensure that the deceased would have everything they needed in the afterlife. But perhaps the most significant removal was that of the heart, the seat of emotion and identity in Egyptian belief. For many, the heart was considered the most vital organ, essential for the soul's judgment in the afterlife. Some mummification rituals included the removal of the heart, leaving the deceased in a vulnerable state, cut off from the emotional and spiritual essence that would carry them through their journey. After the organs were removed, the body was treated with natron, a naturally occurring salt, which dehydrated it and prevented decomposition. The process of drying the body was grueling and painful, a harsh reminder of the fragility of human life. The body would be left to dry for up to 70 days, during which time it would shrink, and stiffen, creating a lifeless shell that would bear the signs of decay and aging. This long period of desiccation symbolized the passage of time, the disintegration of the physical body, and the spiritual suffering that was required to purify the soul. The body's decomposition was an essential part of the ritual, marking the transition from life to death, from flesh to spirit. Once the body had been sufficiently preserved, it was carefully wrapped in layers of linen bandages, which were often coated in resin to ensure the mummified body would remain intact for eternity. This act of wrapping was deeply symbolic. It represented the soul's transition from one form to another. The linen bandages were meant to bind the body and protect it from the outside world, symbolizing the ties that bound the deceased to their earthly life while also preparing them for their passage to the afterlife. The wrapping process itself was performed with reverence and care, as it was believed that the more meticulously the body was wrapped, the more likely it was to be granted favor by the gods. The final stage of mummification involved the placing of the mummified body into a tomb. The tomb was not just a burial place, it was a sacred space where the deceased could be honored and where they would begin their journey through the afterlife. The tomb was stocked with food, treasures, and offerings, all of which were meant to sustain the soul and guide it on its journey to eternal life. The deceased was often placed with items that they would need in the afterlife, including amulets, jewelry, and even tools to help them navigate the dangers of the underworld. This elaborate process was not just an act of preservation, it was a symbolic act of transformation. The body that had once been a mortal shell was now something else, a divine, sacred entity prepared to enter the afterlife. But beneath the elaborate artistry of the mummification process lay an unsettling truth. Immortality was not freely given. It had to be earned, and the process itself was an ordeal that mirrored the suffering that the soul would endure in the afterlife. The body was not simply being preserved for future generations to study or admire, it was being prepared for the soul's rebirth. This rebirth required immense pain, not only physical but also psychological, as the living came to terms with their inevitable mortality and the necessity of suffering in the pursuit of eternal life. The very act of mummification was a reminder that no one, no matter their social status or wealth, could escape the pain of transformation. It did not matter if you were a pharaoh or a commoner. The process of passing through death to reach the afterlife required suffering, purification, and sacrifice. For the Egyptians, the mummification ritual was the culmination of their beliefs about death and immortality. It was the ultimate act of devotion, a symbolic expression of their faith in the gods and their belief in life after death. However, there was more to mummification than just preserving the body, it was about the soul's journey through the underworld. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul, or Ba, would need a physical anchor to return to in the afterlife. Without the body's preservation, the soul would have nowhere to rest. The mummification process was therefore not just about keeping the body intact. It was about providing a place for the soul to reside for eternity. The body, in this case, became a vessel for the soul's continued existence, symbolizing the intricate relationship between the two in Egyptian spiritual belief. Thus, mummification was the final step in a long, agonizing process of death and rebirth. It represented the Egyptian belief that in order to achieve immortality, one had to undergo a transformation that was both painful and divine. Immortality could not be achieved through peace, it could only be obtained through suffering, sacrifice, and the ultimate purification of the soul. The mummification process, with all its rituals and sacred acts, was the gateway to eternity, a gateway that could only be opened through pain and suffering. And in the end, the body, transformed into something sacred and divine, would join the gods in the afterlife, forever preserved in its eternal state of suffering and rebirth. In the quest for immortality, ancient Egyptians faced a terrifying paradox. The very immortality they sought came with a heavy price, one that could bring about not just physical decay, but eternal torment. While the rituals of mummification and bodily sacrifice were intended to ensure the soul's safe passage to the afterlife, they also carried a dark side. Immortality was not an unquestioned gift. It was fraught with risks, and there were ancient curses that loomed over those who sought to tamper with the sacred forces that governed life and death. The search for eternal life was not only a spiritual journey but also one that involved complex psychological and moral implications, drawing attention to the extremes of human desire, hubris, and the deep-seated fear of non-existence. The concept of the curse surrounding immortality emerged from the Egyptians' belief in Ma'at, the cosmic order that balanced life and death. It was understood that the gods and the divine forces of nature kept the universe in harmony. To disrupt this divine order by seeking immortality through forbidden means or excessive greed was believed to anger the gods, and with their anger came consequences far more severe than mere death. Immortality, when forced or improperly obtained, would never be a blessing. Rather, it would become a curse that would weigh down the soul, trapping it in a cycle of eternal unrest. The most famous manifestation of this curse came in the form of the legendary tombs and treasures of the Pharaohs, particularly during the New Kingdom period. The tombs of the Pharaohs, especially those built for powerful rulers like Tutankhamun, became the focus of stories about the mummy's curse, a curse believed to be invoked on anyone who dared to disturb the resting place of these ancient monarchs. The tombs were lavishly decorated and filled with treasures intended to accompany the deceased on their journey to the afterlife. But as these tombs were sealed away, a dark whisper emerged. Those who disturbed the resting places of the pharaohs would be struck down by the wrath of the gods. The most famous curse associated with immortality is the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs, which gained prominence after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Several members of the expedition that uncovered the tomb met untimely deaths, fueling a belief that the curse was real, a warning from the ancient world that death was to remain undisturbed. This belief in a divine retribution for the act of unearthing the dead spoke to a deep-seated fear in ancient Egypt. The belief that immortality could not and should not be tampered with, for to do so would bring about an unrelenting curse that could stretch across time. The curse was seen as a spiritual consequence for violating the sanctity of death and the afterlife. For the Egyptians, the tombs were sacred, and disturbing them was considered a grave offense that could anger the gods. The very notion of attempting to disturb the dead in their eternal resting places was perceived as an act of disrespect, an attempt to subvert the natural order of life and death. By transgressing these sacred boundaries, individuals believed they were inviting divine retribution. The bodies of pharaohs, high priests, and nobles, carefully mummified and preserved for eternity, were viewed not only as physical remains but as sacred vessels for the gods' power. To disturb these vessels was to risk a divine curse that would impact not just the body but the soul itself. As we delve deeper into the psychology of immortality, we realize that these curses were more than just superstitions. They were powerful psychological deterrents that reinforced the Egyptians' belief in the sanctity of life and death. The concept of the curse also highlighted the fine line between immortality as a divine blessing and immortality as a punishment. For those who sought immortality through the wrong means, their reward could quickly turn into a punishment. The living could not escape the consequences of attempting to artificially manipulate life and death, and the curse was a vivid reminder that immortality came at a cost. Furthermore, these curses were not just limited to the tombs of pharaohs. They extended to anyone who sought to manipulate life after death, particularly those who engaged in forbidden rites, such as attempting to achieve immortality through dark magic or unholy sacrifices. The Egyptian belief in magical rituals and the use of spells to protect the deceased from malevolent forces was deeply ingrained. However, there were also spells that were believed to be used in darker, more forbidden practices. These rituals, performed by rogue priests or those seeking personal power, often involved manipulating the dead's journey or forcing souls to return from the afterlife. The concept of forcing a soul to return was considered a horrific abuse of divine power, and those who engaged in these acts were often said to be cursed to live a miserable existence, either trapped in the realm of the dead or subjected to eternal torment. These curses were seen as direct reflections of the Egyptians' understanding of the soul's journey after death. The soul was fragile, and its fate was determined by how the living respected the balance between life and death. The gods, ever vigilant, were believed to punish any deviation from the sacred paths that ensured a smooth passage to the afterlife. Immortality, therefore, was not just about achieving life beyond death, it was about maintaining the right balance between suffering, purification, and divine will. The curse of immortality also emerged as a metaphor for the futility of human efforts to control death. Even in death, the Egyptian elite were not exempt from the concept of divine justice. Pharaohs, though considered gods themselves, could not escape the forces of nature and the inevitable decay of the soul. In the end, the idea that immortality could be obtained through the manipulation of life was ultimately seen as flawed and dangerous. The punishment for these attempts was not just physical death, it was an eternal curse that would trap the soul in a cycle of torment, never allowing it to rest in peace. This curse reinforced the idea that death and the rituals surrounding it must be approached with humility and respect for the divine forces that govern the universe. Seeking immortality through improper means would always result in failure, either through the suffering of the soul or worse, through a curse that ensured the soul's eternal unrest. The Egyptians understood that immortality was not to be taken lightly, it was a divine gift granted by the gods, and it could be lost through arrogance, greed, or defiance of divine order. Thus, the curse of immortality served as both a warning and a reflection of the deeper spiritual realities that governed the ancient Egyptian understanding of life and death. Immortality, in all its allure, came with the harsh truth that it was not a prize easily won. It was a responsibility, a weight that would leave its mark on the soul forever. The curse was a reminder that the price of eternal life was not only physical suffering but the eternal consequences of tampering with the divine forces that governed life, death, and the afterlife. The role of the priesthood in ancient Egypt was one of immense power, responsibility, and sacred duty. Within the religious framework of Egyptian society, the priests were not merely servants of the gods, they were the mediators between the divine and the mortal realms. As guardians of sacred rituals, they were entrusted with guiding the living and the dead through the most profound spiritual transformations, including the terrifying rituals that promised immortality through suffering. The priests were tasked with leading initiates and the deceased through a series of rites that would purify the soul and prepare it for eternal life, often involving physical pain and spiritual sacrifice. These rites required a level of emotional and psychological endurance that was extraordinary, as they had to navigate the fine line between performing sacred duties and enduring the very suffering they were inflicting on others. In Egypt, the temple was not just a physical building, it was a symbolic space where suffering and devotion converged. The temples were seen as the homes of the gods, the very places where divine power was believed to dwell. As such, they became the focal point of rituals that could bring about both death and life, destruction and rebirth. The temple priests were responsible for maintaining the delicate balance of cosmic order, Ma'at, and ensuring that the gods were properly honored through rituals that often involved blood, pain, and sacrifice. The most sacred of these temples were home to some of the most disturbing and sacred rites, where the link between the physical and the divine was established through suffering. The priests themselves were not exempt from these rituals. In fact, their devotion to the gods demanded that they, too, endure pain and suffering in ways that mirrored the very acts they performed for others. In order to be deemed worthy of their role, priests had to undergo their own form of physical purification. Initiates would go through grueling trials and rituals to prove their dedication to the gods. These trials could involve fasting, self-mutilation, and isolation, acts designed to break down the physical body and prepare the spirit for the spiritual burdens of priesthood. The temple priests were often considered to be above mortal suffering, but their physical purity and devotion required that they endure trials that would have broken most men. The relationship between priest and initiate was complex and fraught with tension. Initiates who sought to undergo the sacred rituals of suffering were placed in the hands of the priests, who would lead them through a transformative experience that could include self-inflicted wounds, ritual mutilation, and grueling physical endurance. These rituals were not performed lightly. They were seen as essential for ensuring the initiate's soul would be purified and their immortality guaranteed. The initiate, in many ways, was being prepared to walk the very same path as the gods themselves, who had suffered greatly and endured unimaginable pain as part of their divine journey. The priests were not just spiritual leaders, they were spiritual guides through this excruciating, divine transformation. The most chilling aspect of these rites was that the priests themselves had to embody the very suffering they were overseeing. They had to experience the pain, the dismemberment, the bloodshed, and the torment that their initiates would face. This was not just about administering suffering, it was about fully understanding it, feeling it, and becoming one with the suffering that was central to the spiritual purification process. The priests were required to endure the same trials they would impose upon others, a psychological ordeal that demanded both physical and emotional endurance. The very act of walking the path of suffering was meant to elevate them spiritually, making them closer to the gods they served. As part of their sacred duty, the priests also participated in the burial rituals for the dead, overseeing the mummification process, which itself was a form of symbolic suffering. The act of preparing the body for the afterlife was an intensely sacred ritual, but it was also a deeply disturbing one. The priest's role in dismembering, embalming, and wrapping the body was an act that required both physical strength and spiritual clarity. In many cases, they performed these tasks with a detached reverence, understanding that the body was not merely a lifeless vessel, but a divine creation undergoing a necessary transformation. This was a delicate balance, as the priests were tasked with ensuring that the body's suffering in death would purify it, guaranteeing its safe journey into the afterlife. In some cases, the priests themselves took on the role of divine figures in the rituals of sacrifice. The most famous example of this was the priestly role in the ancient Egyptian opening of the mouth ceremony, where a priest would use ceremonial tools to symbolically awaken the dead. The ceremony involved striking the body with ritualistic force, symbolizing the divine resurrection of the deceased. But this ritual was not simply a symbolic act, it required physical power, and the priest had to physically impose force upon the deceased body, reminding the living of the sacred nature of suffering as a path to spiritual rebirth. The psychological weight of these practices was immense. The priests who carried out these rituals were often trapped in a paradox of their own. They had to instill in others the belief that suffering was the key to eternal life, yet they themselves had to confront the reality of this suffering, both for themselves and others. They were the ones who would guide the soul of the deceased through the most painful stages of transformation, yet they were also the ones who had to live with the consequences of performing these acts. For a priest, the sacred responsibility to guide a soul to immortality was tied directly to their own personal suffering, an endless cycle of pain that marked their service to the gods. At the heart of the priestly role was an existential struggle, one that was both physical and spiritual. The priests of Egypt were caught in a delicate web of duty, suffering, and spiritual ambition. The very rituals they conducted were not merely physical acts. They were deeply transformative experiences that connected the priest to the gods, but also to the human condition in its most painful and broken form. In this way, the priesthood in ancient Egypt became a living embodiment of the tension between the divine and the mortal, between suffering and redemption. The temples, with their sacred rites of suffering, were not just places of worship. They were the very heart of the Egyptian spiritual universe. Here, suffering was not seen as a punishment or a flaw. It was a necessary process of purification and transformation. The priests were the ones who, through their own suffering, embodied the connection between the human and the divine. In their hands, the souls of the living and the dead were shaped, purified, and prepared for their journey toward immortality. But with such immense responsibility came tremendous psychological strain. The priests were constantly confronted with the reality that immortality was not a peaceful, serene gift, but something that demanded great sacrifice. The temple became a place not of comfort, but of pain and transmutation, where the soul's journey was one of continuous struggle. It was in this paradoxical space, where suffering and salvation intertwined, that the ancient Egyptians believed immortality could be obtained. And it was the priests, walking the path of pain alongside those they served, who were the living embodiments of this sacred, eternal struggle. In the Egyptian worldview, the gods themselves were not abstract, omnipotent entities detached from human experience. Rather, they were deeply intertwined with the very fabric of human existence, experiencing the same suffering, sacrifices, and rebirth that the mortals under their charge would endure. For the ancient Egyptians, the gods' experiences were both a reflection of divine power and a mirror to the very human condition they governed. But perhaps most chilling of all was the way in which the gods themselves had suffered, endured pain, and offered their bodies as sacrifices, teaching mortals that to achieve immortality, one must first transcend the pain of life itself. One of the most striking examples of this divine suffering is the story of Osiris, the god of the afterlife, death, and resurrection. Osiris' tale was one of profound agony, loss, and eventual rebirth. He was the beloved ruler of the earth, a god who had brought civilization to Egypt and was revered as a figure of wisdom and justice. But his own brother, Set, driven by jealousy and hatred, betrayed him, tricking him into entering a coffin, which was then sealed and cast into the Nile River. Osiris' suffering was extreme, betrayed by his family, abandoned to die in the most humiliating of ways. His story was not just one of a god losing his life, it was the story of a being who experienced emotional and physical torment, setting the stage for his eventual resurrection. Osiris' suffering was not in vain. It was through his death and subsequent resurrection that the Egyptians learned the true meaning of sacrifice. Osiris, torn apart and cast into the river, came back to life through the intervention of his wife, Isis, and her deep devotion to him. This act of resurrection was not a simple return to life. It was the act of transfiguring suffering into something divine. Osiris became the ultimate symbol of rebirth, showing that death was not the end, but a transformative process that required suffering and struggle to reach the afterlife. This narrative of Osiris was deeply ingrained in the Egyptian spiritual consciousness. It represented the ultimate sacrifice, the idea that only through intense suffering and a divine intervention could one overcome death and achieve immortality. The god himself became the template for the transformation of the soul. The Egyptians understood that for the soul to pass through the trials of the underworld and into eternity, it must first experience the ultimate suffering, a fate that mirrored the agony of Osiris. And through this, they believed that their own suffering would serve as a means to transcend mortality, to purify themselves and be reborn in the afterlife. But it wasn't just Osiris who endured suffering for the greater good. Many of the Egyptian gods went through similar torturous trials, each facing their own form of agony and torment as a means of achieving or maintaining their divine status. Ra, the sun god, had his own painful journey, symbolized by the daily struggle against the forces of chaos. Every night, Ra would travel through the underworld, facing the serpent Apep, who sought to devour him and extinguish the light of the sun. Ra's nightly battle was not just a physical fight, it was a metaphor for the daily struggle of life, where light had to battle darkness and death. Ra's suffering was not a one-time event, it was a continuous cycle, echoing the eternal struggle between life and death, creation and destruction. These gods embodied the ultimate paradox. They were immortal beings who had to suffer to maintain their divine status. In their agony they found power, and in their deaths they found resurrection. For the Egyptians, these divine trials were not just stories of suffering. They were lessons in how to transcend pain, how to embrace the inevitable agony of life and death, and how to transform that pain into something sacred. In this context, the gods were not just distant beings worshipped from afar, they were intimately connected to the human experience. They showed the Egyptians that suffering was not something to be avoided or feared. It was an essential part of the divine cycle, the very foundation upon which immortality was built. By suffering as they did, the gods taught that pain was not just an affliction to be endured, it was a means of purification, a rite of passage that would ultimately lead to divine enlightenment and eternal life. The human soul, in the eyes of the ancient Egyptians, was seen as inherently flawed. It needed purification, an intense, often painful process of cleansing before it could stand before the gods in the afterlife. And it was through suffering that this purification occurred. This deep connection between divine pain and human suffering created a direct spiritual link between the two. The gods, in their agony, became examples of how suffering could be used as a transformative force, a sacred tool that could break the soul free from the constraints of the mortal world and prepare it for eternal life. The story of the gods' suffering extended far beyond just Osiris and Re. Each deity had undergone their own personal trial, often involving physical pain or death. Even the goddess Hathor, the goddess of love and motherhood, was associated with sacrifice. In one myth, Hathor's rage became so intense that she descended to earth in the form of Sekhmet, the lioness-headed goddess, to punish humanity. Her wrath was destructive, and she caused immense suffering. But through a complex process of appeasement and devotion, Hathor's wrath was transformed, and she was able to return to her loving form. Hathor's story illustrated the duality of divine suffering, the balance between destruction and creation, chaos and order, love and rage. These divine trials were the touchstones for the spiritual path of the Egyptians. They were not just stories of gods undergoing suffering, they were deeply instructive myths that taught the Egyptians about the necessity of suffering in their own lives. For the Egyptians, their gods did not simply reign from on high, they lived through the same agonies and triumphs that humans experienced. The gods' suffering was their way of teaching humans how to endure, to transform, and to ultimately ascend to the afterlife. This sacred understanding of pain and suffering, passed down through the divine examples of the gods, became a central tenet of Egyptian religious practice. The gods' suffering was not an isolated event but a continuous, repeating cycle that permeated the entire structure of Egyptian spirituality. The message was clear. Immortality was only achieved through the transformation of suffering. Only those who could endure and transcend pain could hope to join the gods in eternal life. As the Egyptians looked to their gods for guidance, they saw that immortality was not a peaceful state of divine leisure, but a constant state of struggle, rebirth, and transcendence. It was through this suffering, this divine cosmic cycle, that immortality was earned, and in this the gods became eternal teachers, showing mortals how to navigate the painful journey of life, death, and rebirth. Immortality, after all, was not a final resting place. It was an ongoing, transformative process, rooted in the painful but necessary purification of the soul. In the shadow of the grand temples and sacred rites, one of the darkest truths about ancient Egyptian spiritual life was the way in which cruelty and suffering became intertwined with honor and divine favor. While the ancient Egyptians are often remembered for their architectural marvels, their advanced understanding of the afterlife, and their reverence for the gods, there existed a much darker side to their religious practices, a side in which pain, suffering, and death were not only tolerated but revered as necessary steps towards spiritual enlightenment and eternal life. To the ancient Egyptians, mercy was not always a virtue. In fact, it was often seen as a hindrance to the divine order. Suffering, on the other hand, was essential, and cruelty, especially when it was done in the service of the gods or in maintaining Ma'at, the divine order, was seen as an honor, a necessary and justified means to an end. At the heart of this ideology was the belief that life, death, and suffering were all part of a cyclical process that ensured cosmic balance. The Egyptians did not shy away from the notion that death and suffering were inevitable. Rather, they embraced them as integral to the human experience, to the God's will, and to the soul's ultimate journey. The idea of mercy, especially the kind that sought to relieve pain or prevent suffering, was considered a threat to this natural cycle. In the Egyptian view, to prevent someone from experiencing their destined pain or death would upset the cosmic balance and in turn the proper flow of life in the afterlife. This was especially true for those who had violated the natural order. Criminals, those who had committed heinous acts, or those who had broken sacred laws of Ma'at were seen as disruptors of this balance. Their punishment, often severe and cruel by modern standards, was viewed as not just a necessity, but a divine action that ensured the stability of the universe. Their suffering was seen as a form of purification for their souls, a way to cleanse the contamination they had caused through their transgressions. This concept was deeply embedded in the cultural psyche, and even the most brutal of punishments were accepted as the will of the gods. One of the most infamous examples of such cruelty is found in the treatment of criminals and traitors within the Egyptian state. Those who were found guilty of the most serious offenses, such as treason or sacrilege, often faced death by torture. Public executions were common, and the methods employed were deliberately designed to humiliate and torture the condemned. These punishments were meant to serve as both retribution and a cautionary tale for the public, a reminder of the consequences of upsetting the divine order. The most severe forms of punishment were often carried out in front of large crowds, as a means to demonstrate the god's wrath and the importance of maintaining Ma'at. In these public spectacles, mercy was not an option, it was a show of divine justice and the maintenance of cosmic law. Perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of Egyptian cruelty was the practice of human sacrifice, which was reserved for the most sacred of rites. While human sacrifice was not as common in Egypt as it was in other ancient civilizations, there were certain occasions where it was believed to be necessary to honor the gods and appease their anger. In these cases, the gods themselves were thought to demand the offering of human life in exchange for divine favor or the continuation of cosmic balance. These sacrifices were not seen as acts of mindless brutality, rather they were viewed as solemn, sacred duties, rituals performed to ensure the survival of Egypt and the prosperity of the people. To deny the gods their due was considered an affront to the very fabric of life itself, and thus the lives taken in these sacrifices were seen as necessary for the greater good. One particularly disturbing practice involved the sacrifice of individuals during the funerals of the pharaohs. It was believed that when a pharaoh died, his spirit would travel to the afterlife, but that journey could be perilous. In order to ensure the smooth transition of the pharaoh's soul, slaves, concubines, and even members of the royal court might be ritually killed and buried with him. These human sacrifices were seen as an essential part of the pharaoh's passage into the afterlife, providing him with the attendants and servants he would need to accompany him on his divine journey. In the eyes of the Egyptians, these deaths were not cruel acts. They were viewed as acts of honor, carried out for the good of the state and the continuity of the afterlife. Mercy in such matters was considered weakness. Cruelty, however, became an act of loyalty and service to the divine. The priests, who were responsible for overseeing the rituals of the dead, were often the ones who carried out these executions and sacrifices. For them, cruelty and pain were not anomalies, they were tools to be used in the service of the gods. The act of taking a life in such circumstances was not seen as a loss but as a necessity to maintain cosmic harmony. The priest's role was not merely to officiate, they were active participants in the act of purification through sacrifice. Their duty was to cleanse the soul, and in doing so, they too were marked by the suffering they inflicted. In this way, the priests were bound to the same moral logic of suffering as the gods they served. They were not mere intermediaries, they were part of the sacred cycle of death and rebirth, of life and suffering. In this role, mercy had no place. Beyond the physical sacrifices, the psychological toll of this belief in cruel justice can also be seen in the lives of those who served in these roles. The priests, having participated in the suffering and sacrifice of others, were often deeply intertwined with the notion of divine cruelty. They were taught that it was their duty to bring suffering to those who were deemed unworthy, to ensure the balance of Ma'at was not disrupted. In a society where suffering was seen as an essential part of the divine order, the priesthood itself became a vessel for cruelty. The psychological impact on those who carried out these rituals must have been profound, as they were repeatedly called upon to perform acts of violence and cruelty in the name of religion and justice. This intertwining of cruelty and honor was not limited to the actions of the priests or the pharaohs alone. It was embedded in the very fabric of Egyptian society. The idea that suffering, even at the hands of the state, was a necessary and honorable part of life was central to how the Egyptians viewed their relationship with both the divine and the human. It was through this suffering, this submission to divine will, that one could achieve immortality. For the Egyptians, cruelty was not only justifiable, it was sanctified by the gods. In the end, the death of mercy in ancient Egypt can be seen as a natural consequence of the society's worldview. The belief in cosmic balance, the need for purification, and the reverence for the divine will of the gods shaped every aspect of Egyptian life, from the punishment of criminals to the sacred rites of the afterlife. In this world, pain was not just an inevitable part of life, it was a necessary passage, a tool of divine transformation and ultimately the key to immortality. The cruelty that was so often inflicted was not seen as an aberration but as part of the cosmic cycle, ensuring that life, death, and the afterlife continued in their eternal dance. The death of mercy in this context was not a tragedy, it was simply the harsh reality of the divine order. The legacy of ancient Egyptian practices, steeped in suffering, sacrifice, and the pursuit of immortality, leaves us with a profound, unsettling reflection. For the Egyptians, pain was not an obstacle to be avoided, but a necessary tool for transformation. Their view of suffering as the pathway to eternal life challenges modern perceptions of death and the afterlife. While we may now look at their rituals as barbaric or foreign, They were driven by a deep, spiritual understanding of existence and the gods' will. The gods themselves suffered, and in their suffering they achieved immortality. This cycle of life, death, and rebirth, marked by pain, was not merely religious doctrine but a psychological and cultural way of coping with the harsh realities of life. Today we live in an age that seeks to eliminate suffering through medicine, technology, and comfort. Yet, the questions that plagued the ancient Egyptians still linger. What price are we willing to pay for immortality? Will we, too, sacrifice to achieve something beyond our mortal existence? The ancient Egyptians believed that suffering was not just inevitable but sacred, a process that purified the soul and prepared it for divine union. Their dark, painful practices were ultimately driven by an unshakable faith in the transformative power of pain. In the end, their legacy reminds us that immortality comes at a cost. Whether through ritual sacrifice or the pursuit of technological advancement, the quest for eternal life will always be intertwined with suffering. The ancient Egyptians understood this, embracing it fully as a divine necessity. Today their legacy challenges us to ask, what will we sacrifice in the name of eternity? And, in doing so, we confront our own mortality and the lengths we are willing to go to escape it.